The sun was sinking behind the red cliffs of New Mexico, painting the sky with orange and gold. Caleb Morgan rode slowly along the narrow trail, the sound of his horse's hooves echoing softly against the rocks. He was a quiet cowboy, not much of a talker, and had been riding since dawn, driving a small herd to a nearby ranch. His life was simple: work, eat, sleep, repeat. But that evening, something unusual caught his attention. As he passed through a dry canyon, he heard a weak cry. At first, he thought it was the wind. But then it came again, faint yet desperate, echoing between the stones. Caleb pulled on his reins, listening closely. There it was again, a voice soft but filled with pain. Without wasting time, he turned his horse toward the sound and followed it through the twisting path until he reached a shallow creek bed, where the storm from the day before had left a mess of broken branches and mud. There, half covered in dirt and water, lay a young woman. A horse had fallen beside her, its saddle twisted and broken. The animal was gone, but the woman was alive, barely. Her arm was trapped under a heavy piece of wood. She tried to move, but gasped in pain. Caleb jumped down and hurried to her side. "Hold still," he said gently, kneeling beside her. Her dark eyes opened just a little. She looked at him sharply, her face tense with fear and distrust. Her clothes and beads showed she was Apache. Caleb knew what that meant. Helping her could bring him trouble if her people found him. But he couldn't leave her there. "Don't touch me," she whispered weakly, her voice shaking. "You would do what most white men do." Her words stung him. Caleb had heard the stories. Settlers taking advantage of the native people, promises broken, lives destroyed. But he wasn't like that. He didn't even know what she meant by her accusation, but he knew one thing: she needed help. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said softly. "I'm here to help." She turned her face away, saying nothing. Caleb pushed the heavy log off her arm. She cried out in pain, but he worked quickly, freeing her and wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She was cold and trembling, her lips pale. "I need to get you to shelter," he told her. The rain clouds were returning and the canyon wind was growing colder. Caleb carefully lifted her in his arms. She tried to resist, but she was too weak. He placed her on his horse and guided the animal toward a cave he knew nearby. By the time they reached it, the first drops of rain were falling again. Inside the cave, he started a small fire. The flames flickered against the stone walls, giving the space a soft orange glow. He laid her near the fire and tore part of his shirt to wrap her bleeding arm. She watched him silently, her eyes following every move with suspicion. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer at first. Then after a moment, she said, "Ayanna." "That's a strong name," he said with a small smile. "I'm Caleb." She turned her head away again, refusing to look at him. The silence between them was heavy. Caleb cooked a little of his dried meat and offered her some, but she refused. Her pride wouldn't let her accept food from him. Hours passed. The rain beat against the rocks outside. Caleb sat by the fire, glancing at her from time to time. She was shivering under his coat, though she tried not to show it. Finally, he placed a canteen beside her. "At least drink," he said. "You've lost blood." She hesitated, then took a small sip. He could see that her hands were shaking. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly after a long silence. Caleb looked into the fire. "Because you were hurt," he said simply. "Ain't no reason more needed than that." She studied him with narrowed eyes, as if trying to find the lie in his words. But there was none. His face was calm, honest. He wasn't like the others she'd seen, those who smiled but carried cruel hearts. That night she couldn't sleep. Every sound from outside made her tense. She had learned to never trust too quickly. Yet she couldn't forget how carefully he had carried her, how gently he had treated her wound. When morning came, the storm was over. The sun returned, shining over the wet land. Caleb checked his horse and looked at the trail. They were still far from any settlement or village. Ayanna tried to stand but cried out in pain. Her ankle was swollen badly. "You can't walk," he said firmly. "I'll get you home." "I can go myself," she snapped, trying to hide her weakness. Caleb crossed his arms. "You can barely stand, Ayanna. Don't be stubborn." Her eyes flared, but she could see he wasn't mocking her. He spoke with quiet respect. Reluctantly, she nodded. He helped her onto the horse once again. They rode slowly through the open land, the wind warm against their faces. For hours they didn't speak. Caleb tried not to stare, but he noticed the proud way she held herself, even in pain. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met. strong, brave, and full of fire. As the day grew hotter, they stopped near a small spring. Caleb filled their canteens and handed her some water. She accepted it silently. After a long pause, she said, "My people do not trust white men. Every time one of you comes near, pain follows." Caleb listened quietly. "I reckon I can't blame you for feeling that way," he said. "But not all men are the same." She looked at him sharply, her voice cold. "That's what they all say. But I have seen the truth. My people's homes were burned. Our promises were broken. Our hearts were left empty." Her words were like a knife to him, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Caleb looked down at the ground. "Then maybe I can't fix what others did," he said softly. "But I can do right by you." She said nothing, but something in her heart shifted. She didn't trust him yet, but she began to wonder if he might be different. As they traveled, the heat became harder to bear. Caleb noticed a rattlesnake near her side and quickly nudged his horse away to protect her, taking the risk himself. The movement startled her, but when she realized what he had done, her eyes widened. He had shielded her without a thought for his own safety. By the time the sun started to set, Caleb's arm was bleeding slightly from a scrape he got in the rush, but he said nothing. He just smiled faintly and said, "Looks like I'm the one who needs help now." Ayanna tore a piece from her own clothing and wrapped it around his arm. "You're foolish," she muttered, trying to sound annoyed. But her touch was careful, almost gentle. "Maybe," he said, smiling a little, "but at least we're both still alive." As they rode on, the desert seemed to soften around them. The tension between them began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. Ayanna found herself glancing at him from time to time, wondering how someone like him could exist. A man who didn't look at her with hatred or pity, only simple respect. When night came again, they stopped near a group of rocks that gave shelter from the wind. Caleb built another small fire, and this time Ayanna didn't turn away when he offered her food. She accepted it, eating slowly. "You said before," Caleb began carefully, "that I would do what most white men do. What did you mean by that?" She looked at him for a long time before answering. "I meant that most would help only to take something in return. That is what my people have learned to expect." Caleb nodded slowly. "Maybe some do, but I ain't one of them. You don't owe me a thing." For the first time, Ayanna's lips softened into something almost like a smile. "We'll see," she said quietly. The fire crackled between them. The air was cool and calm. For a while, neither spoke. They just sat under the wide sky filled with stars, two people from different worlds sharing a rare, silent peace. As Caleb looked at her across the flames, he thought about how strange life could be. He had started the day alone, thinking only of his work. Now he was part of something larger, a moment of fragile trust between two souls who should have been enemies. And though neither of them said it, they both knew something had changed. Ayanna had begun to see that not every heart was the same, and Caleb had learned that kindness could build bridges even across the deepest divides. The night stretched on, quiet and endless, as the cowboy and the proud native woman sat side by side, both wondering what tomorrow might bring. The next morning began with a soft golden light spreading across the wide land. The air was cool and smelled fresh after the night wind. Caleb was already awake, feeding his horse, when Ayanna stirred beside the dying fire. Her arm still hurt, but she felt stronger. She looked around for a moment, watching the quiet cowboy move carefully, his every action calm and steady. He noticed her waking and smiled faintly. "Morning," he said gently. Ayanna nodded, brushing the dust from her clothes. "Morning," she replied softly. Her voice had lost some of its coldness. Caleb handed her a small piece of bread and some dried fruit. This time she accepted it without hesitation. They ate quietly, listening to the faint rustle of the desert wind. For the first time since they had met, the silence between them felt peaceful, not heavy. Caleb looked toward the east. "We should start moving," he said. "If we keep a steady pace, we can reach the edge of your lands by nightfall." She looked at him curiously. "You know where my people live?" He nodded. "I've traded near your river before. I know the signs." Ayanna studied him for a moment. It surprised her that he knew so much about the land. Most outsiders only saw the desert as empty, but Caleb spoke of it like it was alive, like it had meaning. As they traveled through the long, open plains, Ayanna began to notice things about him she hadn't before. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried honesty. He didn't boast or demand thanks. He just did what needed to be done. She could see that he was not a man of empty talk but one of quiet strength. The sun climbed high in the sky. The land shimmered with heat and their horses grew tired. Caleb stopped near a cluster of tall rocks that gave a little shade. "We'll rest here a while," he said, helping her down carefully. Ayanna sat on the ground, stretching her leg. Caleb checked his wound, which had opened slightly. She frowned when she saw the blood on his sleeve. "Let me see," she said firmly. "It's nothing," he replied with a shrug. "Show me," she insisted. There was no arguing with her tone. Caleb sighed and removed his coat, rolling up the sleeve. The cut was red and swollen. Ayanna reached into her pouch and pulled out a few dried leaves she had kept from her village. She chewed them a little, then pressed them onto the wound, wrapping it carefully with a strip of cloth. "This will draw out the bad blood," she said. Caleb smiled slightly. "You sound like a healer." "My grandmother was," Ayanna said, her eyes softening. "She taught me things before she passed." He looked at her, sensing the respect in her voice when she spoke of her grandmother. "She must have been a wise woman." "She was," Ayanna whispered. "She used to say that the earth teaches us if we listen, but too many people have forgotten how." Caleb nodded slowly. Maybe she was right. They sat quietly for a while, the wind moving gently through the dry grass. For the first time, Ayanna felt comfortable enough to talk about her past. She told him about her childhood near the river, how she used to chase wild horses with her brothers, how her people sang songs at sunset that echoed through the hills. Her voice trembled when she spoke about the day soldiers came and forced her tribe to move. Caleb listened carefully, his eyes full of quiet sadness. "I can't imagine that kind of pain," he said softly, "but I can understand why you wouldn't trust anyone after that." Ayanna nodded. "Trust is not easy for my people anymore. Too many promises were made and broken." Caleb looked down, turning a small stone in his hand. "Then maybe it's time someone kept one." She didn't answer, but inside, something in her heart shifted again. His words were simple, yet they carried weight. As the afternoon faded, they continued their journey. Caleb's wound began to ache, but he didn't complain. Ayanna noticed the strain in his face, though he tried to hide it. Without a word, she reached out and steadied him when the horse stumbled. Their hands touched for a brief moment, and neither pulled away. The sun was low when they reached a ridge overlooking a long valley. Smoke rose faintly from the distance, Ayanna's village. Her heart beat faster. "We're close," she said, her voice mixed with relief and worry. Caleb smiled tiredly. "Then we made it." They started down the slope, but before they could reach the valley floor, a group of riders appeared from the trees ahead. Ayanna froze. The riders were Apache warriors, her people. They saw Caleb first and shouted angrily, thinking he had captured her. "Stay here," Ayanna said quickly. She climbed down, limping forward despite the pain in her ankle. The riders surrounded them, pointing their spears toward Caleb. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, shouted in their language, demanding to know what had happened. Ayanna lifted her hands, trying to calm them. "He saved me," she said firmly. "He did me no harm." The warriors looked uncertain. They had seen too much deceit from outsiders to believe easily. The tall man dismounted, walking up to Caleb with suspicion in his eyes. "Why would you help her?" he asked in broken English. Caleb looked at him calmly. "Because she needed help. That's all." The man stared for a long moment, then stepped back. Ayanna spoke softly to him in their language, explaining everything. Slowly, the anger faded from their faces. They lowered their weapons. Caleb felt a wave of relief, though he remained respectful and quiet. He didn't want to cause any more trouble. Ayanna turned back to him. "You can come with us," she said gently. "You need rest," he shook his head. "I've done my part. You're home now." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You could stay for the night." "It's a long ride back." Caleb smiled faintly. "I'll manage. I've been on my own most of my life." "I'll be all right." Ayanna hesitated. Something in her heart didn't want to let him go so quickly. But she understood his nature. He was a man who belonged to the open land. She took a small step forward, her voice soft. "When I first met you, I thought you would do what most white men do. I thought you would hurt, lie, or take, but you didn't." Caleb met her eyes, his voice quiet and sincere. "Maybe we can't change what's been done before, but maybe we can start something better." Her eyes glistened. She wanted to say more, but the words didn't come. Instead, she reached into her pouch and pulled out a small stone carved in the shape of a bird. She placed it in his hand. "This means freedom," she said. "Take it with you." Caleb looked at the small gift, touched by her gesture. "Thank you, Ayanna," he said softly. The sun was sinking behind the hills again, casting long shadows across the land. Caleb mounted his horse, tipping his hat to her. "You take care of yourself now," he said. Ayanna nodded, her eyes following him as he turned his horse toward the horizon. The wind lifted her hair, and the evening light made everything glow in gold. He rode slowly away, his figure growing smaller against the endless sky. Each step of his horse echoed like a heartbeat in the quiet valley. Ayanna stood there until he disappeared into the distance, holding the memory of his kindness deep in her heart. When she finally turned back toward her village, her people welcomed her with open arms. They asked questions, but she only smiled and said, "There are still good hearts in this world." That night, as the stars filled the sky, Ayanna sat by the fire and thought about the man who had crossed her path. She realized that sometimes fate brings two souls together not to change the world, but to remind it that goodness still exists. Far away under the same sky, Caleb stopped by a river and looked at the small carved bird in his hand. He smiled quietly to himself. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he felt at peace knowing he had done right. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying with it the faint memory of her voice. And somewhere in that vast silence, two hearts, one of the plains and one of the desert, remained connected by the simple truth that kindness needs no color, no boundary and no reward. And so the cowboy rode on, his spirit lighter than it had ever been, while the proud native woman found a new reason to believe that not all hope was lost. Though their worlds were different, they had met in the middle for a brief and beautiful moment that would stay with them forever.